look at Berkeley today and maybe some of Hume, and I don't know how far we're going to get. Do this. I know it's colder out there, but at least we won't have the door constantly making noise. So I'll pass around a roll in a minute. In order to understand that Berkeley is not crazy, he's not having hallucinations. When he tries to convince us that there is no such thing as a material world with material objects that exist independently of perceivers, Berkeley is basically just following out on the consequences of assumptions that John Locke has already given him. And one of the ways, Berkeley wrote a little book that we used to have people read at the University of Virginia called Three Dialogues between Hylas and Philonous. Hylas is a word for substance or matter, material substance. And Philonous is the lover of wisdom. He's Berkeley, the philosopher. And as I said, most philosophy is not written in dialogue form. But this was. And it was actually a popular book at the time. It was only around 60 or 70 pages. And his strategy there is to shore up the case that John Locke has already given us, that while primary properties might be really in objects, secondary properties are subjective and in us. Secondary properties being things like color, smells, taste. Primary properties are things like the shape of something, its number, its size, feelings of hardness, and an extension in space. And now, if Berkeley only did that, gave us arguments that shored up John Locke's case for secondary properties being subjective. I mean, is that what you think of things? That's not really our common sense view, is it? Don't we think that in some sense there's a blue color in these chairs? That it's not just blue only as it affects us, but that some sort of neutral observer would also see them as blue. But that's not what Locke says. But again, if Berkeley only did that, if he only gave us a case to support Locke's claims that the secondary qualities are subjective and mind-dependent, then he wouldn't go beyond Locke. But what Berkeley then does is, and I have an example or two in this PowerPoint, is he goes on to make the case that even primary properties are subjective and mind-dependent. Now, look at the slide that I wanted to start out with. From our perspective, what we call a material object what we experience, let me go pass this around so I don't forget. Again, this is not unusual that we get a skeleton crew that the day after I give a test back, the class day after. Anyway, for us, a material thing is just a combination of the various qualities it has, right? An old-fashioned telephone like the one I've got pictured in the slide is just a combination of its secondary properties like its color, its feeling of coolness to the touch, the sound of its ring, but also a telephone would include its primary properties like its size, its number. This is only one telephone, not its telephone number, but how many telephones it is. And things like its shape, that it's extended in space. These are the primary properties. But what Berkeley tries to do beyond Locke is give us arguments, as I said, to support the claim that the primary properties also are subjective and mind dependent. Well, the consequence of that is the whole thing, what we experience as a material object, is subjective and mind dependent. The word mind dependent means dependent on a mind to exist. In other words, for Locke, the secondary properties are subjective and mind dependent. You don't get the color green without having a perceiver there to experience green. And similarly for heat and cold, and other subjective properties, other secondary properties. So again, here it seems like we're making picayune little distinctions, but the logical consequence of them is something that some people find shocking to common sense. In fact, one of the amusing things about reading Berkeley's book, and even when I was teaching at Hartford Community College, I used to have them read it because it's very readable. One of the amusing things is to see Berkeley trying to convince us that even though his position is that there is no such thing as matter, material substance, everything is of the nature of mind or the experiences, the ideas and minds, is to have Berkeley try to convince us that nonetheless his view is not contrary to common sense, when just about all of us would say, yes, it's very anti-common sense. Those of us who, in other words, there's not a person in this room who doesn't believe that these desks and chairs were there unperceived, between Monday and today, right? Even when nobody's in the room. So as we saw then, not all properties are really in objects. Like the red color of the telephone is not really in it. The primary properties of the telephone and the molecular motion of its atoms and molecules cause us to have a sensation of red. So it's produced in our minds when we look at it by molecular motion. But for Locke, the size of the telephone, its extension in space, is a primary property, and is a property that the telephone has, for Locke, in the real world, independent of any perceiver. Likewise, the shape of the telephone is a property it really has in the real world, because that's a primary property. Its number In other words, that the telephone is one telephone. Its capability of motion in space, that you could move the telephone from one side of the desk to the other, or what have you. For Locke, all those properties are in the telephone, independent of perceivers, and are there in the room as a property of the material object, the telephone, even when nobody's around. For Berkeley, that's not the case. So Locke separates us from the real world. We do not perceive the world for him, then, as it actually is. We perceive a world where objects, for us, have primary and secondary properties, but for him, the real world has only primary qualities. Now, this view has a name. Remember I said for Locke, ideas are the immediate objects of perception. They are what the mind is immediately acquainted with. On Locke's view, our mind is never acquainted with anything at a distance, like the distant book bag sitting up here, briefcase, whatever you want to call it. But it's only acquainted with its own ideas. So, because the mind is only first acquainted with its own ideas, any experience we have of a real world beyond us is, for Locke, indirect. That is, as I said, we have like a mental picture of, say, the whiteboard over there, which accurately represents its primary properties, that it's one whiteboard. It represents its size in the room, its rectangular shape. All those are primary properties. But the silver of the edges and the white of the whiteboard, those are subjective and in us. So Locke's view is called indirect realism. Realism because he believes, like Descartes, that there is a real world. We're not in a dream world for Locke. There is a real world of real material objects that are around, even if there's no one to perceive them. But this is indirect realism because we know that real world only indirectly through our ideas and sensations. So I define it, indirect realism, the doctrine that we cannot know the real world directly through our experiences, but know it indirectly through our mental pictures, if you will, of the world. In other words, how many of you have ever met the first president, Barack Obama, or ever seen him speak in person? None of you. I haven't either. And yet, every one of us thinks that if he walked into the room, we'd recognize him. Why? Because we've seen representative images of him in the newspaper, on the internet, on television. So we believe that if those representative images are accurate, we know what Barack Obama looked like. For those of you who are in Maryland, our former governor was Martin O'Malley. He was not my favorite governor, nor was he my favorite mayor, but he was, regardless. So I'm sitting in a little barber shop in Hamden a few months ago. I've never met the guy. Actually, I saw him once in person before, so I guess I ought to correct myself. But let's suppose I had never seen him in person. Still, I've seen representative images of him, especially when he was running for president in the primaries against Mrs. Clinton. So, The door opens and in walks Martin O'Malley to get his hair cut. And I thought, is that who I think it is? In this little barber shop on a Friday afternoon in Hampton? And yes, it was. So, but I could recognize him because I'd seen images of him. So we must infer that what the real world is like from our subjective inner sensations and ideas, from our experiences. But this is the problem with a view like Locke's. It leads us inevitably down the garden path to skepticism. And it leads to skepticism, as I say in this slide, since we perceive only our own ideas, our own subjective experiences directly, and never what they represent. We can never compare our ideas with reality to check their accuracy. Now, I probably need to get a more up-to-date example, but way back in the 90s, maybe when some of you were only weren't even a gleam in your parents' eye. What passed for state-of-the-art in video was a VCR, but not just any VCR, a hi-fi stereo VCR. And I had some extra money, and I wanted to upgrade my VCR to one of those. And we had a local stereo store that was very similar to H.H. Gregg or Best Buy, even though it was local in Charlottesville, where I was going to grad school then. Anyway, there was no such thing as a flat screen TV the way we have them now. Excuse me. If you wanted a big screen TV back then, they existed, but they were some version of what you see here. They were either a direct projection TV, or what you could buy were big screen TVs where the projector was inside a big box and it shone an image. So anyway, they had a whole store full of these that they were trying to demonstrate. And the way they did it was to take what passed for a home video camera back then, which was a big VHS camera that's as big as the ones you see them carrying on the sidelines of football games. That's what you bought back then. I had a relative who bought one to take family home movies of his young kids. So they had the camera pointed at a doll with a colorful dress on that was on a little doll chair, right? Now, when we played backgammon in the 70s in some of these hotel bars, they had projection TVs way back in the 70s, and they were absolutely horrible. It seemed like anywhere you went, the projection TVs, the colors were off, they weren't focused right, they had a terrible picture. Well, by the 90s, the technology on this kind of a set had progressed to where you got a pretty good image. So what am I doing? Where am I going with this? Well, they were trying to demonstrate that these TVs would give you a pretty good picture. Now, suppose you walked into that stereo store and you were going to buy one of those TVs or considering it, and you thought, well, I want the one with the most accurate picture that represents the colors well and accurately, because not all of them did. How would you check that? In other words, they were filming this doll in real time and they were feeding the picture to all these sets. What would you do? Well, think about it. This is not rocket science. right? You look over at the doll on that chair, and you say, okay, so what do the colors look like? Oh, okay. Now, let's look at the pictures on the TVs. Which one most accurately represents what I see there, right? And if you're going to buy one and that's what you wanted, maybe you'd buy the one that where the representative colors and shapes and all were as close to what you actually saw. What am I getting at? On a view like Locke's, there's no such thing as getting behind our ideas, our subjective experience of the world, to experience the real world directly, and then compare that with our subjective experience of the world to see if our subjective ideas accurately represent the world as it is. So this leads to skepticism, because not only can't we confirm on a theory like Locke's that our subjective ideas really represent things in the world, that our ideas of primary qualities really resemble things in the world, like a picture of Barack Obama resembles Barack Obama. We also, and this is what's relevant for Berkeley, we cannot support the claim that they represent anything at all. And now we're back to a conjecture like Descartes. How do I know that my mind isn't creating all these? And Hume later is going to say that our ideas, our perceptions, are caused by external material objects which they resemble, is an indefensible statement. Hume said, maybe they are, maybe they aren't. Maybe they're produced by the mind or some other cause. And so Hume said, you know what, we ought to be skeptical about the existence of a material world. Now, Berkeley claims not to be a skeptic. He claims his view accords with common sense, but he says, look, I don't like the skepticism that a view like Locke's implies. We do experience the world directly, says Berkeley. But what is the world for Berkeley? Now, what you have to understand is John Locke, I have on my shelves a book that he wrote commenting on some aspect of Christianity. He's some sort of a Christian, probably in the Anglican Church of England tradition, since he was from England, but probably not as devout as Berkeley. Berkeley is extremely devout, and besides being a professional philosopher, an academic who taught at the University of Dublin, Trinity College Dublin, not the University of Dublin, Trinity College Dublin, where I've actually given a paper there before. I was over there in the mid-'80s. Berkeley later became a bishop in the Church of Ireland. Okay? Berkeley doesn't like giving people even the notion that there may be an independently existing world of material objects that's there regardless of whether we perceive it or not. Like Descartes would have thought, like all the ancient philosophers would have thought, and like John Locke would have thought. Berkeley thinks that, as my mother used to say, you give them an inch and they take a foot. Berkeley thought this is a challenge to traditional religious belief. Because he says if we give people the assumption that there's an external material world existing independently of them, they might go down the garden path to being what we call materialists, to concluding that there is no such thing as immaterial substance, that not only does a material world exist, but a material world is all that exists. And then what happens to the claim that we have an immaterial, immortal soul? What happens to the traditional belief, like the Bible says, that God is a spirit and those who worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth? Well, if there is no spiritual substance, what happens to God? So Berkeley sees the very belief that there is an external material world as a challenge to traditional Christian religious belief. So he tries to undermine it. As I say here, he tried to defend Christianity against materialism, the view that only matter exists, by advocating immaterialism, which is also called idealism. A better word would have been ideaism, but it doesn't roll off the English palate very well. So idealism is the view that all is mental. Everything is of the nature of mental substance. And it consists either of minds, which are immaterial, and the experiences in minds, the ideas in minds. So Berkeley is not mad. He's not hallucinating. He's fully rational, but he's just following out the assumptions that he's given to try to argue for the case that the material world is basically an illusion, that the world is real, but it consists only of ideas. So he renounced indirect realism. We experience the world directly, but the catch for Berkeley is the world we experience is ultimately mental. In other words, those desks you're sitting on are for Berkeley a collection of mental ideas. Your body is a collection of ideas. So he claimed we have direct knowledge of what we call physical objects, but these objects are mind dependent. So the world that we experience commonsensically for Berkeley is ultimately a mental world. Matter does not exist. If you mean by matter, material objects that exist independently of perceiver. No physical objects exist independent of minds. And if you look at the top, you can summarize Berkeley's whole philosophy in one little phrase, and I believe this is Latin. Like I say, I didn't come from a family of Polish Catholics who would have taken Latin in elementary school. I came I'm a descendant of Slovak Baptists who literally fled Eastern Europe because of religious persecution from the Catholics. So esse est percipi means to be, to exist, is to be perceived by some mind or other. Here is a quote from not his three dialogues, but a more technical, longer book, The Principles. And by the way, the three dialogues, Berkeley you get people who wrote some of their best stuff, like Immanuel Kant. If he had died in his early 50s, he'd get some little blurb in an encyclopedia of philosophy that's an inch long, and we would. He did most of his best writing after the age of 55. On the other hand, you get people, even David Hume wrote the treatise in his mid-20s. Berkeley was kind of a prodigy. And so even though you might think of these people as stodgy old people, and probably if you pulled up a picture of George Berkeley on the internet, it would be from a later painting where he's in full garb as the Bishop of the Church of Ireland. But when Berkeley wrote this, he was about 20 years old. He wasn't much older than any of you, you know. And here's what he says. It's a direct quote. "It is indeed an opinion strangely prevailing amongst men, amongst human beings, not just males, that houses, mountains, rivers, all sensible objects — sensible means all objects we can perceive with our senses — it's our opinion that these things have an existence distinct from their being perceived by the mind, by the understanding." But Berkeley goes on to say, but what are the aforementioned objects but the things we perceive by sense? And here is what is called the theory of ideas coming into play. And he says, and what do we perceive besides our own ideas or sensations? Remember, Berkeley's in the same camp that says we never perceive a world beyond our sensations, which they represent. And what do we perceive besides our own ideas, and is it not plainly repugnant that any of these should exist unperceived? So esse percipi means to exist is to be perceived by some mind or other. Now, as I said, and it's bothering me a little this morning, I had a motorcycle accident in my when I was about 17, and I still have pains occasionally in my left shoulder. So Berkeley agreed with Locke that secondary properties are mind dependent, but he provided additional arguments in support of this. But his crucial move here, his crucial move is to provide arguments for the primary qualities being mind dependent. One of the arguments he provided as an additional argument, besides that bucket argument you saw, that heat and cold. Suppose you come in and it's cold outside and you stand by the fire. And it feels pleasant, right? Suppose we got a big fireplace here. You come in and it feels pleasant to stand by the fireplace when you're cold, maybe a little wet. So Berkeley says a moderate degree of heat is a pleasure, a pleasant sensation. But now suppose I tried to get warm too quickly and put my hands in it, and I thought, oh, whoa. And I burned my hand a little bit. An intense degree of heat is a pain. But Berkeley says, now wait a second though. You wouldn't want to say that pain and pleasure are in the fire as properties of the fire. So what makes you want to say that that degrees of heat are in the fire as a property of the fire? Now you got to watch out for these guys. They'll talk you out of your wallet. They are slick, right? So that's one argument that Berkeley gave to support Locke's claim that heat and cold are subjective and in us. They're not in the fire. But don't we all think, yes, it is in the fire, right? So he provided similar arguments, though, to show that even the primary properties are also subjective. Now, here's something that is not my own unique observation. People made this observation in the 20th century. I was talking about the pain in my shoulder. Suppose I met you at the door, and I said, now watch out. When you go in the room, there is a pain wandering around in the room, and I don't want you to get a pain in your shoulder. There's nobody in the room right now, but there's a pain in the room that you need to watch out for. First of all, you'd think I had gone off the deep end. What's Borowski talking about? You can't have a pain in there without somebody being in there who's capable of feeling pain, without some sentient mind. You can't just have a pain running around unperceived, unfelt by anybody in the room. Apply that. Now, what is a pain for Berkeley? It's only an idea, a perceived idea in our mind, a sensation. Multiply what you can say about pain, that it's repugnant that a pain should exist unperceived, and extend that to every other property a thing can have, which is just for Berkeley ideas or sensations. And he's saying it's repugnant that any ideas or sensations should exist unperceived, but that's all things are for Berkeley. And so to be is to be perceived. For that death to exist is for it to be perceived by some mind or other. So, as I say in this slide, if it makes no sense to say a pain exists so no mind is perceiving it, it also makes no sense to say that sensible qualities, like color, sounds, tastes, etc., exist in objects independent of perceivers. Now, Berkeley does make a distinction here. We only have a few minutes. Suppose I walk in this direction. I don't have a choice about whether or not I'm going to run into a table here, right? In other words, there are some ideas I can experience that are independent of my mind, but if I close my eyes and imagine a horse, say, I can control that idea. I can control the color of the horse, the type of horse, whatever. Da-da-da-da-da-da. Say, well, all right, why go off on this tangent? Well, for Berkeley, there are ideas we have that are under the control of our own will. But for the ideas, like the ideas of these desks you're sitting on, and this table that I couldn't help but bump into, those are also ideas in God's mind. So on Berkeley's view, you cannot take God out of the picture because God is directly responsible for all of our perceptions, for the ideas that we don't perceive. And so only minds and the perceptions of minds exist. So idealism means the only things that exist for Berkeley are mental. And so there's a size. Here, these are the kinds of arguments that Berkeley used to try to show that even the primary properties are mind dependent. take a mite's foot, a little dust mite, extremely small to us, but to the mite, it's of ordinary size. And they knew about one-celled organisms. They had microscopes then. To a germ on the mite's foot, it seems huge. And if this seems like a strange example, you ever look out the window of an aircraft? After a while, the people on the ground start to look like mites, right? But you know, to them, their feet are ordinary size. They're ordinary size, walking around on the ground. To you, going up in the plane, they're starting to look like dust mites the higher you get. So he says size, the mite's foot can't be both small and large at the same time. So we must conclude, just like we did with the secondary property of warmth and cold in the water experiment, we must conclude that the mite's foot that there's no such thing as the size of the mite's foot. That whatever size the mite's foot is, it's relative to a perceiver. Now, you know, these also are responsible for some of the relativistic moves we have. So he provided similar arguments to show both primary and secondary properties are mind-dependent. So that means the entire telephone is mind-dependent and dependent on a perceiver. And that's Berkeley's view in a nutshell. And he says we can't even conceive of things like color apart from primary properties like extension in space. So he said they're all one. We can't even separate out primary from secondary properties even in thought. Okay. So we can't conceive of something that's extended in space and moved without also giving it a secondary property. So, well, I'm going to leave it there, and we'll pick it up, and then I got to see where we're going to go next, because we may not go to the next item on the syllabus.